Welcome, everybody. We are here today for the talk of mother work in a global community. We have soon to be three amazing guests with us. Isabel is going to be joining us in just 1 second here. And I wanted to welcome everybody who's joining us today. It's a lovely morning here in Chicago, but we also have three different women from different parts of the world. We have Anne O'Brien from Ireland and Maria Collier de
Mendoza.
Mendoza. We just did this before, from Brazil, and Isabel Torres will be joining us from France in 1 second. So I wanted to have this talk today because I know in the United States, of course, many mothers have been struggling and, both with work and home and everything like that. And of course, at least in the United States, I feel like our media oftentimes focuses very much on US-centric concerns. I thought it'd be wonderful to have a chance to talk with other mothers, primarily mother scholars who have made it their life work to study the culture of motherhood. And of course, many of us are paying close attention to what's going on with the pandemic and how things are changing. So that will also be layered into the conversation. So I'd like to start, we'll start with Anne, if you want to just give a very, very brief introduction, because then we'll circle back with a few questions, but just tell people where you are, what you do, and why you're here today.
So I am Dr. Anne O'Brien. I'm an associate professor with the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University. Maynooth is a little university town just outside of Dublin. And my interest in motherhood and work kind of comes out of a lot of research that I've done on gender inequality in creative industries. So I'm particularly interested in women who work in film and television production or other kind of creative jobs and how they experience kind of inequalities at work. And then my research on mothers has been kind of as a subset of that. So we can talk more about those as time goes on.
Wonderful. Maria?
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from Brazil, and I am a professor at the Communication Studies area in the Federal University of Pernambuco in Recife, northeast of Brazil. And my PhD was a binational study on motherhood in advertising. So I did part of the study in Canada, part of the study in Brazil. I currently am working with Brazilian mothers, media, and COVID-19. And I've seen my friend Florence is here. Hi, Florence, nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Katie. I hope we have a great conversation.
Of course. And Isabel, sorry, we had a little bit of a mix up on our side here, but Isabel is also joining us. And if you could offer a very brief introduction before we dive into the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Katie, it's great to be here. So I'm a science editor and science communicator and founder and CEO of Mothers in Science, which is a nonprofit organization that supports mothers in STEM and advocates for workplace equity and inclusion of parents and caregivers. I'm based in France. I'm a solo mom of 4 kids, and I've recently adopted a dog. 4 kids and one dog.
Wonderful. I love dogs, by the way. So congratulations on the addition.
Thank you.
So Maria, we're going to start with you. Recently, I was watching the John Oliver show. I don't know, I think that's cast around the world, but he's basically a satirist news comic sort of person. And he was talking a little bit about how COVID has been mismanaged from his point of view in Brazil. And of course, I think different countries have handled things differently, but I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background in terms of what's going on with that and particularly how it's been impacting mothers specifically in your country.
Okay, thank you. I will not, if you want, we can use the slides. If not, I can talk because
you should have capabilities, but that's up to you.
Yeah, okay. I don't know how to, because I'm not used to Zoom. We use the Google Meet here. So I can show without the slides. First of all, I'd like to say we have a population of 210 million inhabitants in Brazil. And the official data says we are almost reaching 500,000 cases of COVID. So we are the third in the world ranking. It's a lot. If you compare to what's going on the world, we are just behind the US and India. It's a lot, but the other thing I'd like to say is that this official data has some delays because we are a very big country and the system is not so well integrated. So it might be more than 500,000 cases. This is the first point. And the other thing I would like to say is that Brazil is shaped by several inequalities, and these inequalities are structural, such as income, education, poverty, gender, unemployment, housing, and domestic violence. We are the 7th more unequal country in the world, according to the United Nations. We have almost 70%, 70 million of the population, the adult population in Brazil, did not complete high school. Another thing, 32% of the population who are Black and brown in Brazil earn less than $5.50 per day. So we have these difficulties. Besides that, if we compare the income of white men with brown women, they earn 44% more. What's going on in the pandemic is that women basically are the frontline care workers in all dimensions, in schools, in the health system, in the pedagogy and school education system. And this gender inequality prevails also in academia. If you look at the leadership positions, we have much more men than women. Then the mortality in terms of COVID is higher in the lower income neighborhoods where the Black, the brown, and the indigenous populations live. And the unemployment is growing much more among women than men, and specifically among mothers. And what's going on is that social distancing is impossible for people who live in favelas and poor neighborhoods. This is also another problem. And there's one specific problem that I would say that homes are not safe in Brazil. So if you look at the violence, domestic violence, violence against women, and violence against girls or children, the numbers have grown a lot in the pandemic. So this is the overall context. But if we look at the communication and media ecology, what's going on here is that, as a paper I read from Ortega and Orsini, two scientists from Brazil, they say we are facing a moment of governance without a central government. And that's exactly what's going on, because the federal government's not doing his job. You know, they are just, how can I say, they're giving information which is not clear. And the overall picture is a scenario of fake news and infodemia. That's very serious. The government, the federal government, has been denying the impact of the pandemic and confusing the population. That's very serious. For example, they have been defending the use of chloroquine and vertical isolation. They have been doing discourses of denialism of science. And this is polarizing public opinion because the majority of the population here has very low levels of education. And then this is the overall pictures, but when you look at the mothers, I would say they are very stressed. On the other hand, we have activists and scientists who are doing a very good job. That's one issue. I would like to show the images later, Katie. I'm not familiar with the Zoom here, and I not want to go over my time. So please let me know how long have I spoken.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. This is all very important. So it's.
So I think that I've been observing very interesting things on Facebook, on Instagram. We have scientists who have been publicly speaking on YouTube, on lives, and on Instagram, on Facebook. Like, for example, how can I show the slides? Because I'd like to show the scientists who became a mother. It's a platform, they have a blog, and this girl, she's a scientist. She always posts very interesting things and she does lives. There's another scientist also does this type of things. And there is a doctor, Drauzio Varela, that does this type of things. So we have some new voices showing up in the media scenarios, individual voices, I'm saying. But we have also institutions, which are some collectives, some NGOs for maternal mother actions and involvement. That's very interesting. And the latest thing that I would like to show some slides to you is the academic movement that's going on, that's really, really interesting and important in my point of view. So we have, for example, students, undergraduate and graduate students, who are mothers that are gathering together in the public universities and organizing collectives. This is very important because they are fighting for what the mothers needs in academia. So they are together to defend rights and talk about the needs for the inclusion and for the permanence of mothers as students. And the other thing is that we already have some scholars gathering together and doing projects to talk about motherhood, not only as a field of study, but as a need for the inclusion and for the permanence and for rights. For example, when there is a public notice, how can you compete if you have just come from a maternal leave, for example? So if you have young kids, you have the right, we have a lattice platforms. Our Brazilian scholars need to have a CV lattice on this platform. That's a scientific platform. So now you are allowed, there is a law that you can put on the lattice that you have been on maternal leave. And then some universities are already launching research funding competitions or opening new funding competitions for science and for research projects, that they take this into consideration so mothers will not be in disadvantages. And this conquest came from parenting science. That's a movement that's very important. They've been doing a great job. And they advocate for the inclusion for parents. You know, they consider the needs for parents, not only mothers, but also fathers from young children, basically, because we have different needs. And then when we talk about inclusions, and we have these in Brazil as well, as there is in Europe and North America, the way they evaluate your productivity is very quantitative. So when you are on leave, when you have a kid, of course, the productivity is not the same. So if you can help me to show how to show some images, I can do that. That would be cool, because then I can show this Instagram and so on. Besides that, my friend Milena Freire and she's a professor at the Federal University of Santa Maria, we've been doing a research with mothers, not only academic mothers are included. And from the whole country, we did this research online. Her students participate of our team. We had a team of 10 students with us. And then we interviewed more than 2,000 women who are mothers in Brazil. And we understood what's going on in the pandemic with these mothers. And there is a paper we have published last December in the Journal of the Motherhood Initiative for Research and Community Involvement in Canada with the results of the quantitative study. So I know I don't have time to talk about these, but I'd like to show the images from the internet and from these Instagram profiles very quickly, so you can see the illustrations of what I have just said.
If you roll your mouse down on your screen, I believe you'll see something called share screen.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then if you hit that, that should be able to have everybody else see it.
Okay. Oh, no.
There you go.
So let me see. Yeah, found it. Just let me look now. Oh, so this is the book that Milena and I are organizing. We are organizing a collective book with more than 15 authors from Brazil about motherhood in media. It will be launched in July. This is the paper I was talking about.
I'm not sure if the screen is following what you're saying.
Sorry. What happened, Katie?
Anne, do you see something different than I do?
I can just see your window with the PDFs listed and I think it's a PowerPoint. Have you clicked the PowerPoint, Maria?
Yeah, I'm showing the PowerPoint. Can you see that?
No, we're seeing the previous screen.
Ah,
If you close it by opening it again.
stop sharing. Okay, now share screen. Yeah.
It was the right process. I think something, maybe there was just a little glitch
Does
there.
it show it now?
There.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so this is the book, Motherhood in Media. And this is
Maria did the pictures for and the illustrations and graphics, which I think is just so impressive. Sorry to interrupt.
We
there.
don't have budget to the scientific budget had a very strong cut here in Brazil. So we did to do the design, the editing, the copy editing, the everything. Milena and me, we are multitasked, and we have a very good student, Camila, that did the design with us. So they did a great job. So this is the paper, and then the images. This is some pictures of my PhD, and this is the images I was going to show you. Just a minute. Here, for example, some families living in the streets in São Paulo due to the poverty increasement in the pandemic. This girl here, she was killed accidentally last week from a stray bullet. What does it mean? It means the military police in Rio has been very aggressive with the poor population in the favela, specifically if they are Black, and then she was going to visit some relative there, and she was 4 months pregnancy. She was accidentally killed by a stray bullet. So this is very sad, and this happens very frequently in Brazil. And here is the scientist who became a mother post, this one. It's about pandemic stress and children, and she's talking about how to help her, the kids. And this was a very cool post from a feminist site, newsletter, and they say working at home and living at work. I really liked what it was. An interview with a school teacher, and I liked the way she pictured it. That's how mothers are feeling, very stressed and tired. And then some news. So 80% Brazilian mothers are exhausted, while in other countries only 48%. And then the media is covering what's happening. And what I would like to say is that this does not happen in general media. We have some left-oriented media that are approaching the issues, what are going on with mothers, but not everyone. And this meme, I think this is very representative, because we have here in Brazil a very strong agribusiness industry. And it's very unequal because they have huge properties and multinational companies planting, for example, soy here and other commodities. And this idea of the mother that can do everything, that she's the super mom. Here, it's using the words they use at the advertising from the agribusiness. So it says, Madres are agri. That's the nickname for agribusiness in Brazil. Mothers are tech, mothers are pop, mothers are everything. They are on Instagram, they are on Facebook. Mothers are the industry and the wealth of Brazil. Because the advertising of the agribusiness says this. They say agri is tech, agri is pop, agri is the industry and the wealth in Brazil. So here, this neoliberal approach that you can do everything by your own comes very quickly and very clearly So I love this meme as a symptom of what's going on. And here you can see one university student that denounced the professor that didn't allow her to breastfeed during the remote class. Now we can see some of the one startup that supports maternal mentoring for the small business mothers do after leaving the labor market. And there's another feminist consultancy, Think Olga, that works with the mother issues. Here are some of the collectives I was talking about, the students' collectives from different universities. So they talk about what researchers are doing on motherhood. They are organizing lives like ours today. They are organizing courses about motherhood studies. They are doing lots of interesting things like organizing collective ebooks like Milen and I are doing. And this is the Parent in Science post. So they really have been doing a great job. That's what I would like to show. I'm going to stop to share. I just would like to give you an overview what we are doing. And despite the cuts, despite the right-wing government, I think things are moving on here in a very interesting way. And I have hope that we will be able to change things and give mothers the need, to the support for inclusion and permanence in the universities.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's really
Thank you. It's a
interesting to hear Maria and I had a few different conversations over the past couple of weeks. And so I think you summarized a lot of that very well there. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And so in terms of at least what we're hearing in the United States, I hear a lot about England struggling with how to approach COVID and some of the same things that I think Maria was talking about in terms of should we be taking this seriously, immunizations, et cetera. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's been going on in Ireland specifically and how you think some of the ways that the government has reacted and the way families are set up, what has that meant for how mothers are working through COVID right now?
Yeah, I suppose we have a very different COVID story, Maria, to the one you've described. The deaths in Ireland from COVID are still under 5,000. And I think what was interesting is that Ireland has really, in a way, paid a price for that because we've had a very strict lockdown regime. So even though we've managed to mitigate a lot against deaths from the disease, it's come at a huge cost to the society. So March 2020, I walked out of this building I'm in at the minute thinking I'd be back in 2 weeks. And we really still haven't come back to work. We're still working from home where at all possible. So we've had a very long period, 15, 16 months now, of ongoing kind of lockdowns. From March, a lot of people just went home, school books were sent home. And we found ourselves, my experience was typical in lots of ways. I found myself sitting at home at the kitchen table with a secondary schooler, which is kind of high school, and a primary schooler. And I think what's really striking for a lot of women in Ireland about that experience was the multiplicity of roles that we had to take on. People talk about working from home, but they don't really unpack what that working is. And it's the working of trying to run your university department from your kitchen table when your degrees are changing all the time, because we have a media production degree. So we really had to rethink what we were doing. So work itself wasn't even normal. And yet I was trying to do it from home. Suddenly I was educating, I'd use a large pair of inverted commas for that, my 2 children with varying degrees of success, who were literally at home as well. The level of domestic work that we all had to undertake kind of tripled. There's 3 people in my household, my 2 sons and myself. And because we were all at home all of the time, the actual volume of domestic labor increased exponentially. And then there was a whole layer of care work to do during that, with family members becoming ill, and just the level of kind of care and concern around looking after children. So there was a lot of ways in which the nature of working from home is such a kind of glib misnomer for what was really going on for people on the ground. That's fairly typical. Like, a lot of people in Ireland has a really, really poor childcare infrastructure. So where we depend on privately provided creche care, it's really, really expensive. Oftentimes people will be paying more in childcare than they're paying for a mortgage on their houses, and property in Ireland isn't cheap. So that all shut down overnight, and the public school system shut down as well. So it really threw a lot of women back on their own resources at an individual level to care for kids. And the gender disparity between couples where women and men were both working from home was really quite phenomenal. You know, anecdotally, and some colleagues here in Maynooth have published a paper kind of where a lot of women report how they took on a lot of that work, and male partners, you know, were expected to be on Zoom calls and went on Zoom calls from morning till evening. So in Ireland pre-pandemic, women were doing 76% of all care work. So we were carrying that disproportionate care work with a childcare system that is not very well supported or doesn't exist kind of at a public level, depending on the school system for a lot of care for kids and after school, and then family arrangements or ad hoc arrangements around childcare. So I think that really became salient for the women who were doing the work. And then, you know, just in terms of care, like, or help through, you know, being able to outsource work to cleaners or any of that, that all kind of went out the window as well. So women were doing an awful lot more work than they had been doing, and doing it all at home. And I think there has been very, very, very little recognition of that. I think there's a lot of lip service paid to it, but not an awful lot of real acknowledgement that this is a problem. It was one that was kind of borne by women in the country. And now, as we go back to normal, there's kind of, I don't know what the expectation is. There's a lot of discussions about, you know, new forms of working and flexible labor. And I think the thing that really struck me while trying to do kind of formal work and childcare work simultaneously is that you can't do two things at once. You can't be providing that care work and also be doing your formal work. Whereas the way employers kind of talked about work, it was as if those two things could be done simultaneously. And it really strikes me that, again, we're back to the sort of the rendering invisible of women's work, that it's, you know, goes on in the background. They're just looking after the kids. It's not really a big problem. Whereas for the women who are actually doing it, I think we really acknowledged how much of an issue it was. So that was, and then you have quite a very strong feminized workforce in Ireland in terms of caring institutions. So a lot of our nurses are women, and a lot of the social care workers that were in residential care units or nursing homes, it's a big female labor force. So for them to be able to go out to work, to do their necessary frontline jobs, that raised a real crisis as well in terms of, well, who was going to look after children? And the discourses around that were interesting, even though I think they went relatively unsolved since. Another layer to it that was quite interesting was how kind of masculine the discourses were around COVID. So the reason Ireland had to have such a severe kind of lockdown regime was that we've the lowest ratio of ICU beds to population in all of Europe. So we didn't have very many ICU beds available. And so we had to keep the rates very low, or our hospitals would become overwhelmed. And the people that were in charge of that were a group called NEFIT, which are the kind of medical advisory body to the government. And Irish people are very news aware, very tuned in. We tend to discuss things, you know, an awful lot kind of in kind of public discourse. So the media coverage of kind of the official version of COVID was a very masculine narrative. Now, women in media in Ireland are hugely underrepresented. We usually get less than 30% of airtime on most current affairs or politics programs. It's usually about 27%. I think that figure holds fairly constant almost globally, that it's always less than 30% of airtime given to women. So on these decisions that were really, really impacting very heavily on women's lives and on their experiences of COVID and of work and of family life, women weren't very visible in any of the narratives or in any of the decision making. Our political institution is still very male dominated, around an 80-20 split. And within that sort of elite grouping that were making a lot of medical decisions, it was an awful lot of male voices that were heard. And the public discourses around it then tended to be quite male dominated. And so it's interesting that yet again, the whole question of childcare and kind of social responsibility for childcare wasn't maybe as salient as it could have been.
Have you seen women stepping out of work in larger numbers? And that's one of the trends that we have seen is that there was many more women leaving their work than men, and it wasn't necessarily out of being fired. It was because they couldn't handle the exact juggling that you were describing.
Yeah, I think even pre-COVID, women are underrepresented in the labour force in Ireland. So in the kind of 16 to 65 age group, 78% of men are working formally, whereas only 55% of women are. So there is that sort of feminization of care work and women leaving work to look, not necessarily because they want to look after children. It's not like it's an active choice, but oftentimes there's a lot of push-pull factors. And I've looked at this in terms of media industries. So I've done interviews with like 20 mothers who work in media industries who had left media work, and asking them, like, why did they leave? And nobody left because they actively wanted to go home and look after their children. They left because there were just such a constant push and pull. Media industries require really long days, 13-day fortnights, really intense and work where you're really not very available to anything else. And oftentimes it was a relatively small issue, like the breakdown in a childcare arrangement, that would force a woman to kind of just ultimately say, oh, I can't do this anymore. So there was a constant push and pull of factors, even pre-COVID, that forced women out of work. And I'm really struck by Shani Orgad's work is so interesting on this, her book called Heading Home, where she talks to a lot of women who, ended up in that position of being at home while their husbands still worked. And what I really was struck by from Shani's book was, like, there was never a conversation had about that. It just happened that the people who gave up their jobs were women. And I think there's a huge vein of research to do there. And after COVID, to talk to women around, what was decided. I don't have any real hard evidence in terms of data as to how many women left work during COVID. But my sense of it is, Katie, that yeah, for sure, it was women who took the hit, and who either went back to working part-time or just like couldn't do both. And it was definitely women who were doing the disproportionate levels of work around care and schooling and all of that. But I think it would be really, really interesting to unpack, what happened and why it happened. And I think there's still just that really kind of heteronormative notion that the men's work somehow mattered more and that the women could take the hit. And I think what we will see, and I think it's going to go on for years, will be the gap that opens up in terms of promotions as well, for people who had childcare duties versus those who didn't, and the gendering within that, then the mothers with childcare duties versus the fathers. I think it will be really interesting to unpack that and just look to the consequences of it, as to who kind of, used the COVID time to, they started referring to it as, it's like business as usual, but online. Whereas I think for the vast majority of women, it was far from business as usual.
I'm also curious to see, because I think that this could go one of two ways in terms of exactly what you were describing, that either women are going to continue to feel the reverberations of quote unquote off-ramping, even though it wasn't really a choice, or perhaps a rosier view of it would be is that we do see that home responsibility can interfere with work just as a natural course of family life, and therefore have that become more normalized as a result of it happening at such a broad scale.
I think it's kind of interesting, Katie, like in terms of there's this book as well. I don't have any fancy graphics, Maria. I just have this. This is an edited collection that we did just before COVID. And it looks at women working in media industries. And I think the really interesting thing about media industries is that because they have these long hours and this rigid separation of home and life, and it puts all these demands on women, it's almost like a kind of a petri dish for what happened under COVID, where the work requirements are so much that women can't do them anymore. So there's a chapter in that kind of looks to solutions and ways of rethinking kind of work solutions and care solutions to kind of reprioritize women's work, and at a minimum points to the importance of women's work, particularly in creative industries. Like who's going to speak to the experiences of mothers if women who are mothers can't work in our creative industries that make our films, our plays, and our novels? And so, yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Anne. So Isabel, we now turn to you, and I hope that you have a bit of a rosier picture. I have a feeling that most likely France is pretty much echoing a lot of what we're seeing other places, but I was wondering if you could perhaps share a little bit of what you're seeing in France? I know we often, as at least as mothers in the United States, look to France as sort of the model of mothers receiving more support in terms of the creche system and various other supports. Have you seen that play out in terms of women being supported in work and managing home life in addition to the pandemic, or has some of those pieces fallen apart in your opinion?
I think one of the big differences during the pandemic between France and other countries that the government, after the first lockdown, which was a disaster, they just shut down schools, everything. All of a sudden, nothing was prepared. It was very traumatic, like for everyone. And with us, it kind of lasted until the holidays. So yeah, so the first lockdown was very traumatic for everyone. So after that, I think the government had a good think and they decided to prioritize keeping schools and childcare open. So that was a big difference with other countries. So since September, when school started again, September 2020, we've always had schools open until the third lockdown, where they closed down schools, but just for 3 weeks. And we kind of were already mentally prepared. So I think in that sense, it was sort of easier for parents here in France because we could keep on working. In terms of support for mothers, there was nothing specific for mothers. There was some support for parents. I remember receiving a check at some point, 500 euros or something like that, which is not bad. So there was some concern with that. And there was a lot of financial aid during COVID. So not all sectors, but a lot of employment sectors received financial aids, to keep companies open. Whenever like restaurants that had to shut down and they have been closed for a long time, the salaries of the employees were paid, so they had unemployment. So there was a lot of financial aid to keep things open. Even so, there was a lot of businesses that had to shut down. A lot of people lost their jobs. But I think overall, maybe France did a bit better than other countries. So in terms of childcare, there was no real special support. It's just that they made an effort to keep schools and childcare facilities open, which was very helpful. And actually, we didn't have a lot more cases due to that. Other countries chose to shut down schools and childcare, and we didn't have more cases. So I think here they concluded it was mostly restaurants and cafes and places with, where there's a lot of people indoors that were really spreading the virus. So I think that's the main difference. Childcare here isn't that much of a dream. Everyone has this idea. We do have free school from 3 years old, which is very good. So preschool, everything is public, and you don't have any expenses. But childcare is expensive. There's a lot of financial aid from the state, but it's still a lot, I would say. There's very few nurseries, public nurseries. There's a few private nurseries which are very expensive, but most people will hire nannies. Here they are called nounous. And the state will subsidize part of their salary. So if you have one child, it's doable. If you have 2 children that are with a nanny, it starts becoming very expensive. So in our survey, in Mothers in Science, we did the global survey last year. And for France specifically, the reason number one that moms were complaining it's hard to get back to work, it's a struggle, was actually the price of childcare. Whereas in some other countries, that wasn't the main problem. But still, I think we did reasonably okay because they kept schools and childcare open most of the time.
You mentioned that conference, and I know we had spoken previously about it, and in fact, I attended a little bit of it myself, and it was amazing. But the closing talk that you had included with that conference was kind of a high level picture of what we could be doing moving forward and what are some of the solutions we could be thinking about to better support mothers in STEM specifically, and I would presume largely in academia and even beyond that culturally and in work more largely. So I was wondering if you could perhaps offer a recap of what came out of that meeting.
The meeting was very successful. We were surprised. There was a lot of interest, and one of the things we felt with all the interest, and we had a Slack channel, and there was a lot of people, was very active. We found that there is definitely an energy and a momentum, and that a lot of mothers are basically fed up. The pandemic was the last drop. There is more awareness now of the systemic problems. I think that's also what the pandemic has shown, is that the problems were already there. And the problems isn't us, isn't mothers. So we saw a lot of people connecting, a lot of interest in knowing more, a lot of people contacting us. I want to help, I want to do something. So the feedback we have is that the conference was sort of a propeller and a way to get people together to move forward. So we discussed a lot. There were several talks about things that have been done. For example, Maria was talking about the maternity clause in Brazil, which is an example of a policy that can be applied sort of easily everywhere. And there were other examples. There were few. We looked very hard for organizations and institutions who have sort of policies to help mothers specifically. There are very few. We managed to find some. So those are some ideas, but we really wanted the discussion to be focused on structural problems and long-term solutions. And we had a few discussions. And our organization and a few others, 500 women scientists as well, we already have compiled a sort of a kit of recommendations for institutions at different levels, funding agencies, research institutions, for PIs in academia, really things, actionable solutions that they can start applying. So the other thing that came out is that we're really forming a group and starting a movement. We had a meeting at the end of the conference because there was so much interest, and a lot of people got together, and we are starting a global movement. I hope you will join. Please contact me if you're interested, because out of our survey and out of the conference, we realized that these problems are universal, and the pandemic has also shown that. Of course, some countries have their specific problems, but overall, these are universal. So, policies that work in one country should work in another country. So we're now forming a working group or movement to study these policies, to prepare a set of policies and guidelines and start putting pressure on the leaders to make change. So I think that the big outcome of this conference is really that we're starting this movement and connecting people so that we can work together and not let things go back to normal, because now we're approaching the end of the pandemic and everyone is afraid, okay, we're just going back to normal and nothing will change. So we hope we can keep the momentum going and keep on continuing these conversations.
And so perhaps, Isabel, you would like to include some of the information of how people can contact you in the chat box.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you can use that chat box for is to present any questions that you might want to ask our lovely mother scholars today. I have a couple more questions in my back pocket as well, of course, but please feel free to chime in if there's something that you would like to either comment on or ask specifically of one of the panelists or all of the panelists. So the first question I wanted to kick off with while we wait for people to formulate their questions is that we have talked a lot about how really COVID has just shined the spotlight on issues that were already there. It wasn't like this was a massive left turn for any of the situations that you described, it seems. Do you think that with that, there's been an awakening, and do you think politicians are on board to be part of that change right now? Or do you feel like this is still going to be an uphill battle for mothers? And anybody can chime in at this point.
Yeah, I can start because I was just talking about that.
Sure.
So I definitely, it was an awakening, but I would say it was mostly for the mothers themselves. And this is the feedback we get from the community because, for example, if you look around, there are so many initiatives telling how to improve your work-life balance, how to get rid of imposter syndrome, how to, should self-care. And a lot of these initiatives that are supposed to help mothers actually are fixing the mothers and shifting away the focus from the real problems, which are structural barriers, right? Bias and discrimination, lack of childcare, etc. So the pandemic really, emphasized all these problems. And I think mothers are starting to really awake and realize that maybe I'm not the problem. I'm doing a lot more and getting a lot less recognition. And I think this is crucial because, if we accept the situation, nothing will ever change. So again, this is a really good momentum to move forward. Politicians probably see the problem because there has been a lot of media attention focused on these inequalities. But it's been a year and a half, nothing really has changed dramatically. A little bit of change in the US, but the US was far behind in terms of family policy. They are just catching up with the Biden administration. But I think if we want real change to happen, we will have to keep on getting the politicians' attention and leaders in STEM. Otherwise, it will die off. I don't know if you agree.
I think a lot of what you say as well resonates in an Irish context as well. And I think where France might be ahead of us is in terms of the number of women in your parliament who are also mothers. They're severely underrepresented within the Irish political institution, broadly speaking, in Ireland. And I think that's a huge part of it. And including mothers in those decision-making higher level organizations as well, women are very absent from them, and then they're also absent from the media discourse. So while women are busy doing all of the necessary work, that's not being represented. It would be interesting, like if we were to have the conversations about fathers during COVID, what would that look like? What would be the discourses? And how come, and I agree absolutely with what you say about the barriers are structural, and that whole discourse about how mothers just need to lean in more to work to make everything better is absolutely odious. Barriers are structural for sure, but I think there's a huge cultural piece as well. And I think culture, eat strategy for breakfast. Anything we do will get eaten up by that idea that, well, women are natural caregivers and they want to be doing that work, and really they want to be at home with their children, and that it's not really work anyway. The rendering invisible of that labor is really fascinating in ways that I think maybe even some of the fathers in the houses during COVID didn't really see the labor going on. And I think there's interesting conversations to be had there. How come it's okay for men to have children and be politicians, and for men to have worked through and to kind of just leave the kids to their own devices if that's what happened. So I think there's a lot of research needed to unpack the differences for parents in it, and that cultural piece around our beliefs about mothers and what they should be doing.
Maria, would you like to chime in? Or else
I'd like to comment, because what can we see? Brazil is in a very difficult and delicate moment because we have a polarized society. And the thing is, the majority of the population is poor, has low education levels, and democracy is at risk indeed. It's not, what you have been reading on the news is true. So it's very complicated for us because we've been trying to how can I say, to nurture and to motivate our students to develop critical thinking and citizenship and promote social transformation. On the other hand, you know, sometimes to be a scientist in Brazil is almost like being an activist, you know, the way things are currently. So I think this is very important when we look at what's going on, because some voices are already showing up on media, like I told you, like Drauzio Varela. There's another biologist, his name is Attila. He has a YouTube channel, and other voices, other influencers, I would say, that have been doing a great job. But the other thing is that at the university, that's our, how can I say, our environment, we have been trying to bring the look of, you know, bring awareness, I would say, to motherhood as a field of study. And then this is very difficult because we have people from different areas and we need to connect them when we have a very departmentalized mentality, as in your countries it should be. So we have, like, I am from communication. I must produce communication studies. You know, that's what counts for me and for my promotion and for my career evaluation. So when I say I want to study motherhood, what does it mean? And how can I connect to other people who are isolated like me, not only because they are mothers, but because they decided to study motherhood? So that's why I study motherhood in media and in advertising, because I teach media and advertising. You know, like I cannot decide to study philosophy or literature of motherhood, but I can have a friend and a research partner in this field. And that's what we are doing. So we are trying to connect people in different fields, such as history, such as literature, and other connected, mostly in social sciences or humanities, and then put them together to think what we can do together, because one job is to give awareness that motherhood is an important field, is an important subject, is a field of study. The other thing is how to include mothers. And then this is a job the students are doing a very good job. That's what I have been noticing. I've been following their Instagrams, the collectives, and I'm very well impressed about what they are doing. I'm very proud of what they are, how they are connecting themselves and going for their rights and doing their jobs and their lives and getting together, promoting courses. This is very important. And we also have the difference that, for example, I am from a generation of a family of white medium class people. My grandfather was a professor. He was the director of the medical school at the university I teach today. I left my hometown when I was 18. My whole professional career was not made on that city, you know. Now I came back to my hometown as a professor where my grandfather used to teach. And this is, when I see that sometimes half, 50% of my classes are from students who come from poor families. They are the first generation students. So I think since our universities are public, we have these to break. You know, if you want our country to develop, we need to develop opportunities for these students, which has become difficult in the current scenario under the government we have today. So this is very important for us. I think sometimes to be an advisor or to be a mentor is almost like being a midwife. I make this comparison, this analogy, because we are giving birth for a new person, you know, for a person that will have critical thinking, will have opportunities. And this is very important at the current moment of our country. If we want to transform something, to make a more democratic and equal society in Brazil, that's all we need, to give these guys a hand and tell them, don't give up right now, because some of them are giving up, some of them are depressed, some of them do not have good environments at home, their homes are not safe, they live in favelas, they don't have good internet, they don't have access to books in the pandemic. It's been very tough, and we're trying to do our best with the low resources, but we are trying. That's what I can say.
And I do think, obviously the part of the reason for this talk and the work that IMS does and the work that all of you have been doing is the idea that we obviously need to change academia, but we also, it's the way that that reverberates out and helps all women become better educated and better self-advocates for the work that they're doing in their own lives. We had one last question. If it's okay, we're probably going to run over just a couple minutes here, but I didn't want to leave out Florence's question. She has a question for Isabel, and she says, do you think that in France, the fact that there were a few politicians who were mothers did help in considering mothers and the situation of families in general in the management of the crisis? And a question for all in general, does it make a difference that there are women politicians who are mothers who put some pressure on governments in how the crisis was and will be managed?
It's a very good question. I don't know if this, in this particular case, that helped. I would take a wild guess and say yes. And yes, we do need mothers and more women in leadership positions. While we are underrepresented, it will be very, very hard to get these policies there and to even, for them to believe that there's actually a problem. I think even a lot of women experience that if you are in if you're in an heterosexual relationship, your husband will not be aware that you're doing more. I think a lot of us have had these discussions, and you show the evidence and they just, you can't empathize with something that you haven't been through. So I think if we don't have more mothers in government, yes, it will be difficult. But the thing is, we just cannot wait another 2 generation or 2 until that happens. It's just, it's not sustainable. And I think this is what this pandemic has shown, is that this model of society is just not sustainable. Women want to work and they should if they wish to. And we shouldn't be having to make this choice between becoming mothers or having a career. And we shouldn't have to be working 10 times more to be able to have both. So we have to start going for those positions and trying to break the glass ceiling and getting there. But we just can't wait until there's parity. I don't think we can wait. But yeah, in other countries like New Zealand and Germany, where you have women in power, it's so obvious that it makes a difference. It makes a difference. I mean, yeah, it does. So yeah, we do need more women in leadership positions.
I think, Anne, you already addressed that to some degree too. So for the sake of time, I'm going to do our standard last question here.
Can I just comment?
Oh,
Kate?
yes.
I'd like to comment something that I think it's important about politics. Since we are living a very complicated moment here, it doesn't mean if you vote for a woman or woman, if your candidate is a woman, doesn't mean the candidate will necessarily support maternal needs, especially here in Brazil. The conservative parties are having women as candidates because they are women, and that's not enough. Like we have 50% of the population who are women. However, we don't have 50% of politicians who are women. We have only 12%. And if we think about this 12%, how many of them are from parties that support what mothers need? So this is very important to look at the program they are, promoting and what parties they are connected to. So that's all.
Absolutely. We've certainly seen in business and in politics that just because somebody is a woman does not make them necessarily an advocate for women. So certainly more research, to your point, is very, very much required. But with that said, at least for my 2 cents, I do think that to Isabel's point, that sort of lived experience can lead women politicians and women in power to recognize a different set of circumstances that men may not necessarily have been primed to understand, and culturally aren't expected to understand. So for our last question, IMS, for those of you that may not know the full name, is International Association of Maternal Action and Scholarship. So we always try to keep that action component front and center for us. And so our closing question very, very often is, what action step, and it can be something big or small, would you recommend to women both in and out of academia? What can women do to hopefully push for change or make change happen in their lives or their communities or anything like that?
I can start again.
Sure.
Unless you want to. You can join our movement, follow us. We are a very pro-action organization, and we work with many other organizations. So we are also very pro-collaboration, and we are global. And we can help you connect with people in your country to have a more active role there. On a personal level, speaking up is necessary. Of course, it is difficult, especially in academia, because there can be retaliation and it's difficult. We all know that. But, you know, get together with other moms. They are there. There are many moms in academia. If you get together, you'll have a stronger voice. And even asking for simple things, you know, we've had, we know women that just, there was no pumping facility. They asked and they got it. Sometimes department heads, PIs, they are supportive. It's just that they don't know. Again, if they are men, they don't know these problems exist. And the other thing is to really believe in yourself and remember that you are worthy and you don't have to work harder. You are already doing enough, and you just have to be aware of the structural barriers and not listen to the judgment, to the pressure, which is very subtle, common sometimes put us down and push us towards that decision of, I have to choose between a career and a family. So a lot of women will reduce the number of working hours, work part-time, move to a more family-friendly job. And a lot of that, from our research and from what we see in our community, it comes from external pressure. And, you know, this guilt, famous mom guilt that is inflicted on us. So, you know, just don't listen and just follow your gut feeling and keep going.
Wonderful. Maria?
I think I put it on mute. I think that media literacy is the beginning of all here in Brazil specifically, you know, because we've been under attack of fake news. So I think that as a mother, it's very important not to believe in everything that you are watching on media. It's been like a never-ending nightmare. What are the news showing and what are these infodemia showing us? So we need to think, to overcome this thing, you know, to survive in a healthy way. That's very important. And a way to do that, I think, is to begin to separate what's cultural, the cultural values that say you are responsible for all, but you are not a superwoman and you don't have to feel guilty, and then connect with others, like Isabel said. You know, that's the thing, media literacy and get connected.
And Anne, you'll have our closing thoughts today.
Add to that, I think it's to really reflect on the culture that we are steeped in, which is sometimes like a fish trying to see water, and to understand, as Maria and Isabel said, the messages that we receive about what it means to be a mother, and to be reflective and interrogate those and think critically about them. Because I think that whole neoliberal discourses of maternal guilt and kind of intensive mothering can be really destructive and really take from women's power. And I think we need to understand we can be very powerful agents for change, and to demand those changes is really important.
Thank you to all of you. I hope that everybody else here has enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. It was wonderful to see some points of silver linings, let's call them. Somebody that we had on a past episode of the Voices, Visions, and Advocacy series says something about Corona bonuses. And I've adopted that term myself, that, obviously this has been a very, very challenging year, more so for some than others. But certainly I think we've all walked away with a different perspective. And so I hope that there's been some places that we can move forward the conversation over the next few years. And as we move forward with our series, several of the Mother Scholars here mentioned mentorship, and we are going to be offering a 2-part series that's aimed at supporting graduate students who are also either looking at motherhood in their near horizon or are already mothers, and how those who are in university systems can best support those women who are on their campuses. So stay tuned for some of that on Facebook and Twitter. And there's also plenty of ways to get in contact with Anne, Maria, and Isabel. But until next time, thank you so much for your time. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Isabel and Anne.